On March 17, 1869, a mining crew in Colorado broke through a wall of granite and felt heat blast into their faces like they'd opened an oven door. But ovens don't scream. The rocks didn't just crack, they melted. And when Thomas Harwick held his lantern up to see what they'd found, the flame turned black. Not blue, not white, black fire. 3 men ran, 2 men stayed, and by morning, the mine was sealed with 6 tons of concrete, and a warning that still sits in the Denver mining archives today. This is the story of what happened in Shaft 7 of the Redemption Mine, and why the town of Ashfall, Colorado no longer exists on any map. The winter of 1868 hit Colorado territory harder than most. Snow buried the mountain passes until late April, and the mining camps scattered through the Rockies became islands of desperate men counting their supplies. The Redemption Mine sat 12 miles northeast of what would later become Boulder, carved into a mountain the Ute people called Screaming Rock. The white settlers never asked why. Thomas Harwick arrived at Redemption in October of 1868 with a reputation that preceded him like smoke. He'd found silver in Nevada, gold in California, copper in Arizona. Some said he had a gift. Others said he'd made a deal. What everyone agreed on was that Thomas could smell ore through solid rock, and when he picked a spot to dig, you'd strike something valuable within a week. The Redemption Mine had been operating for 2 years before Thomas arrived, pulling out decent silver, but nothing that would make a man rich. The owner, a Boston banker named Caldwell, who'd never seen the mine in person, hired Thomas with a simple instruction: find the main vein, whatever it takes. Thomas brought 5 men with him: his brother Jacob, who handled the explosives, a Norwegian named Lars, who could swing a pickaxe for 12 hours without stopping, 2 Irish brothers, Sean and Patrick Doyle, who'd worked in coal mines since they were children, and a quiet man named Samuel, who never spoke about his past, but had scars on his hands that looked like burns. They started working the week Thomas arrived, pushing deeper into the mountain while the other miners worked the upper tunnels. Thomas chose a spot 200 feet below the main shaft, where the rock turned from gray granite to something darker, almost black, the kind of stone that made your lantern flame flicker even when there wasn't any wind. The first week they made good progress: 20 feet of tunnel, shored up with timber, following a seam of quartz that Thomas insisted would lead them somewhere important. The rock was hard, but it broke clean, and the temperature stayed comfortable despite the depth. The second week, things changed. Lars mentioned it first. The rock face felt warm when he touched it. Not hot, just warm, like it had been sitting in the sun, which made no sense 200 feet underground. Jacob noticed the timber supports dried out faster than they should. Fresh-cut pine that should have stayed damp with sap turned brittle in days. Thomas pushed them harder. He spent hours with his ear pressed against the rock, tapping with his hammer, moving along the tunnel face like he was listening to a conversation. When the others asked what he heard, he'd just smile and say they were close, so close. By the 3rd week, the warm rock had become hot rock, hot enough that the men needed gloves to touch it. The air in the tunnel grew thick and heavy, and they had to install a ventilation system, a series of wooden ducts that pulled fresh air from the upper levels. Even with the ventilation, working became exhausting. The heat drained them. Patrick Doyle was the first to hear the sounds. He was setting a support beam 20 feet back from the tunnel face when he heard what he described as scratching, like something with claws dragging across stone. He called out to the others, but by the time they stopped working and listened, the sound was gone. 2 days later, Sean heard singing. He dropped his pickaxe and stood frozen, listening to what he swore was a woman's voice coming from deep in the rock. The melody was beautiful and wrong at the same time, in a language he didn't recognize. When Thomas asked him to describe it, Sean couldn't. He said trying to remember the tune made his head hurt. The deeper they dug, the stranger things became. The rock face started showing colors it shouldn't. Veins of deep red that looked almost like blood vessels. Patches of crystal that reflected their lantern light in ways that made the shadows move wrong. Jacob found a section of stone that was perfectly smooth, like it had been polished, but when he tried to drill into it, his bit melted. On March 10th, they were 35 feet into the tunnel when Samuel stopped working and refused to continue. He stood in the center of the tunnel, staring at the rock face, and when Thomas asked what was wrong, Samuel said one word: "Wrong." Then he dropped his tools and walked out. They found him the next morning at the entrance to Redemption Mine, sitting in the snow, still staring back at the tunnel entrance. He packed his things and left before noon, never said another word to any of them. Thomas didn't slow down. If anything, Samuel leaving made him work faster. He spent entire nights in the tunnel now, alone, with just his lantern and his tools. The other men would arrive for their shift and find 5 feet of new tunnel dug, the rock face marked with chalk symbols they didn't recognize. Lars asked if Thomas was sleeping. Thomas said he'd sleep when they found what they were looking for. When Lars asked what that was, Thomas smiled and said they'd know it when they saw it. The heat became unbearable. Even with the ventilation running constantly, the tunnel temperature climbed to over 90 degrees. The men worked in shifts now, 30 minutes on, 30 minutes cooling down. The timber supports started to char, not from fire, just from the heat radiating from the stone itself. On March 15th, Jacob was drilling holes for the next blast when his drill bit punched through into empty space. He pulled the bit out and pressed his eye to the hole, trying to see what was on the other side. He jerked back immediately, hand pressed to his face. When the others asked what he saw, Jacob just shook his head. He wouldn't go near that section of wall for the rest of the day. That night, Thomas drilled 3 more exploratory holes in the same area. Each one broke through into the void Jacob had found. Thomas measured the depth. The open space behind the wall was at least 20 feet across, maybe more. He called it a cavern, a natural formation they'd intersected. He wanted to break through immediately. Jacob convinced him to wait until morning. They'd need all hands ready in case the cavern was unstable or filled with gas. Thomas agreed, but he stayed in the tunnel all night. The other men could see his lantern light from the upper levels, a steady glow coming from deep in the mountain. March 16th started normal. The 5 remaining men assembled at the tunnel entrance at 6 in the morning. Thomas had chalk marks all over the wall, showing exactly where they needed to drill and place the charges. This would be a careful blast, just enough to open a man-sized hole into the cavern. They could explore, see what was there, and decide how to proceed. The drilling took 4 hours. They placed 6 charges in a circular pattern, using half the usual amount of powder. Jacob set the fuses long, giving them 2 minutes to reach the safety point 60 feet back. They lit the fuses and retreated. The explosion sounded wrong. Not louder, not softer, just wrong. The pressure wave that hit them felt different than every other blast they'd set off. It pushed against them and then pulled, like the mountain was breathing. When the smoke cleared and they moved forward, they saw that the blast had opened a hole about 3 feet across. But the edges of the hole weren't broken rock. They were smooth, almost melted. And the heat coming out of the opening made them stop 20 feet away. Thomas grabbed a lantern and moved forward despite the heat. He held the lantern up to the opening, trying to see inside. The flame, which had been burning steady yellow, turned black, pure black, like burning oil. But the light it gave off was still bright enough to see what was inside the cavern. Thomas stood there for a full minute, not moving, just looking. Then he turned around, and his face had changed. Not physically, but something in his expression was different. He looked satisfied, like a man who'd just proven something he'd always known was true. "What's in there?" Jacob asked. Thomas smiled. "Everything," he said. "Everything we were looking for." He wanted to go in immediately. Jacob stopped him. The heat was too intense. They needed to ventilate the space first, let it cool down, test for bad air. Thomas argued, but eventually agreed to wait. They set up the ventilation system, running ducts right up to the opening, and let it run for the rest of the day. The heat didn't decrease. If anything, it got worse. But the air coming out of the opening stayed breathable, so Thomas declared they'd enter the next morning. He assigned positions. He'd go first with Jacob. Lars would follow with the surveying equipment. The Doyle brothers would stay outside the opening, managing the ventilation and the safety lines. That night, none of them slept well. The bunkhouse sat 300 feet from the mine entrance, but every one of them later reported hearing sounds. Scratching, singing, voices speaking in languages that hurt to listen to. Jacob swore he heard his dead wife calling his name. Lars heard his mother speaking Norwegian, but the words made no sense. The Doyle brothers heard drums, constant rhythmic beating that matched their heartbeats and made them feel like their chests were going to burst. Morning came fast and wrong. The sun rose blood red, and a smell drifted down from the mine entrance. Sulfur mixed with something organic and rotten. By the time the 5 men gathered at the tunnel entrance, every bird in the area had stopped singing. They made their way down to the opening in the tunnel face. The heat hit them like a wall when they were still 30 feet away, but Thomas pushed forward. He'd brought extra lanterns and rope, enough to explore at least 50 feet into whatever space they'd opened. The opening in the rock had changed overnight. It was wider now, 5 feet across instead of 3, and the edges were definitely melted, like wax, frozen in drips that pointed inward. Thomas tied off his safety rope and ducked through the opening. Jacob followed 30 seconds later. The cavern inside was not natural. That was Jacob's first thought when his lantern illuminated the space. The walls were too smooth, too regular. The floor sloped downward at a steady angle, like a ramp, carved from the same dark stone that surrounded them. The ceiling arched overhead, 30 feet high at the center, covered in formations that looked like stalactites but grew in spirals. And it was hot, temperature well over 100 degrees, the kind of heat that makes breathing difficult and sweat pour instantly. But Thomas moved forward like he couldn't feel it, lantern held high, examining everything. They followed the ramp down for 20 minutes. The space opened wider as they descended, the walls pulling back until they were standing in a chamber the size of a cathedral. And in the center of that chamber, they found the hole. It was perfectly circular, 50 feet across. The edges were carved stone, but the craftsmanship was impossible. The margin was so precise you couldn't fit a knife blade into the seams. And from the center of that circle came light. Not firelight, not reflected light, just a deep red glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Jacob approached the edge carefully and looked down. The hole dropped straight into the earth with no visible bottom. The walls were carved with symbols all the way down, spiraling into the depths. And the heat rising from below was so intense that Jacob had to step back after just a few seconds. Thomas walked right up to the edge and stood there, staring down into the red glow. Jacob called to him, said they should report this, bring more men, equipment, maybe even alert the territorial government. This was beyond a mining operation. This was something else entirely. Thomas didn't respond. He just kept staring down into the hole. Then he started to laugh. Not hysterical laughter, calm, almost relieved, like he'd found exactly what he'd spent his whole life searching for. Jacob grabbed his arm, tried to pull him back from the edge. That's when Thomas turned to look at him, and Jacob saw his brother's eyes had changed. The whites had turned gray. And when Thomas spoke, his voice sounded wrong, layered, like multiple people talking at the same time. "We're going deeper," Thomas said. "There's more, so much more." Jacob ran. He didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and sprinted back up the ramp toward the opening. Behind him, he heard Thomas calling his name, but the voice kept getting farther away, like Thomas was descending into the hole instead of following him. Jacob burst through the opening into the tunnel and nearly knocked Lars over. He was screaming, incoherent, just repeating the word wrong over and over. Sean and Patrick grabbed him, tried to calm him down, asked where Thomas was. That's when they heard it, coming from inside the cavern, not screaming, not singing, a sound that was both and neither. A choir of voices all screaming and singing at the same time, in perfect harmony and complete discord. The sound got louder. Closer, Lars ran, just dropped everything and sprinted for the main shaft. The Doyle brothers hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, looking at Jacob, at the opening, at each other. Then they ran too. Jacob was last, but he stopped at the tunnel entrance and looked back. Something was coming out of the opening. Not Thomas, something using Thomas's body. It crawled through the hole, but the movements were wrong. Too many joints bending in too many directions. And the heat coming off of it made the air shimmer. Jacob ran. All 4 men made it to the main shaft and up to the surface. They were still running when they reached the bunkhouse. They grabbed what they could carry and kept running down the mountain toward the closest town. They ran for 6 hours straight, and when they finally stopped, Lars looked back at the mountain. Smoke was rising from the mine entrance, black smoke that moved against the wind. They reached Central City by nightfall and reported what happened to the territorial marshal. He didn't believe them at first. Not until 3 other miners from Redemption stumbled into town 12 hours later with the same story. The mine was burning from the inside, not from fire. The rock itself was burning, and they'd heard screaming coming from deep underground. Screaming that sounded like Thomas Harwick, but couldn't be because no human throat could make sounds like that for hours without stopping. The marshal assembled a group of 20 men and rode for Redemption Mine. When they arrived, they found the entrance collapsed. Not from structural failure. The support timbers were still standing. The rock had melted inward, sealing the opening like scar tissue closing a wound. The screaming had stopped, but the heat remained. The snow within 50 feet of the mine entrance had melted, and the ground was hot enough to burn through boot leather. And that smell, sulfur and rot and something else that made men gag and retreat. The marshal declared the area unsafe and ordered everyone out. By the end of April, the Redemption Mine was officially closed. The territorial government sent engineers to assess the situation. Their report is still sealed in the Denver archives, but 3 of the engineers who went down there quit their profession within a year. The town of Ashfall, which had grown around the mine, was abandoned by June. The residents reported constant sounds coming from underground, scratching, singing, knocking on their cellar floors from underneath. Children started having the same nightmares. Adults started sleepwalking toward the sealed mine entrance. By July, Ashfall was empty. The territorial government removed it from official maps. The area around Redemption Mine was quietly purchased by the federal government and designated as unusable land. No mining, no settlement, no entry. Jacob Harwick spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen about what he saw in that cavern. Most people thought he'd gone mad from bad air in the mine. Some thought he was lying to cover up an accident that killed his brother. But there were others, old miners, people who'd worked deep underground for decades. They listened to Jacob's story and nodded like they weren't surprised. Lars went back to Norway and never mined again. The Doyle brothers moved to California and worked surface construction for the rest of their lives. Neither of them would enter a basement. Samuel, the man who left before the final breakthrough, was found dead in 1871 in a Denver boarding house. He'd barricaded himself in his room and covered every surface with written warnings. Don't dig deep. Don't follow the heat. Don't listen to the voices. The door down goes both ways. And what happened to Thomas Harwick? Officially, he died in a mining accident on March 17, 1869. His body was never recovered. But there are stories. Reports over the years from people hiking near the old Redemption mine site. They talk about seeing a man standing at the sealed entrance, just watching them. A man covered in burn scars who stands in the heat without sweating. A man who smiles when he sees them, and then walks back into the mountain through rock that should be solid. The last reported sighting was in 2019, a geology student doing research near the old site. She took a photo of the sealed entrance. When she reviewed the image later, she saw a figure in the darkness behind the collapsed rock, a figure that looked like it was waving. She deleted the photo immediately, but 3 nights later she woke up to the sound of scratching on her bedroom wall, the scratching that came from inside the wall. When she moved out the next day, she left a note for the next tenant. Don't listen to the knocking. Don't answer if something calls your name. And whatever you do, don't dig. The federal land around the old Redemption mine site is still off limits today. The official reason is environmental contamination, but the records from 1869 don't mention any toxic materials. They don't mention much at all, actually. Just 3 words repeated in every report filed by the engineers who surveyed the site after the collapse. Seal it permanently. In 1923, a crew was sent to pour concrete into the old shaft. They made it 6 hours before abandoning the project. The foreman's report mentioned tool malfunctions and structural concerns, but his personal journal told a different story. He wrote that the rock fought them, that the concrete wouldn't set, that every man on the crew heard someone calling their name from deep in the mountain. They sealed what they could and left. No one's been back since. But the heat's still there. You can measure it with thermal imaging. A hot spot deep underground that radiates outward with no geothermal explanation. A hot spot that, every few years, gets a little bit bigger. And sometimes, on quiet nights, hikers camping in the mountains report hearing sounds carried on the wind. The distant echo of pickaxes hitting rock. The creak of timber supports. And singing. Always the singing in that language that makes your head hurt when you try to remember the melody. Thomas Harwick found what he was looking for. He followed the heat down into the earth and discovered something that wasn't supposed to be found. The question that keeps geologists and historians awake at night isn't what Thomas found. It's whether he opened a door that was meant to stay closed, and whether something on the other side is still trying to push through. The Redemption mine has been sealed for over 150 years. But every spring, when the snow melts around that old site, the ground stays warm a little longer than it should. And every spring, the warm spot spreads a little bit farther. At the current rate of expansion, it'll reach the nearest town in about 30 years. Maybe that's enough time to figure out what's down there. Or maybe it's just enough time for whatever's down there to finally dig its way.